before some of the others.
Before.
Oh, but I mean, I think you two were.
Oh, were
we in the same issue?
Oh, we gotta come back through that.
I just revealed the fact that I didn't read the other story. There's one that's really good. Look at mine. I'm number 6.
Yeah, tell you. They always pick the strongest word. Number 6.
The cover is amazing for the new issue. Yeah. That's what did you paint that for the book? Or yeah.
And the fun assignment.
Yeah. Oh, you got some good dinner parties.
Yeah.
It's the one coming out.
Sure.
I wonder if they have it here.
I didn't know that you Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. I want to hear all that memory.
Yes.
I want to say how It's very good to see you. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll skip the theatrics. You're not like stuff. Pardon me. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, great. Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so kindly for joining us. I'm Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to our event with Corinna Vallianatos to celebrate her book Origin Stories. You can give a hand. She is joined tonight by Colin Winnette. We can give a hand for Colin. Excellent. Thank you for joining us here in person and also online. Hello, online audience. I'm waving to a camera in case you cannot see. We also have seats in the very front row, which, if you are brave, you are welcome to sit down and join us there. We are broadcasting from San Francisco. We open each of our events with a land acknowledgement. We are operating on unceded Métis Ohlone land, and we think that acknowledgement requires action, and so we encourage you to donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. We have details about the Métis Ohlone Land Trust at the back desk if you are interested in how to participate in this project of rematriation. And 2024 was a really good land back year, and 2025 could be. So let's try and do that. With a lot of other scary stuff going on, maybe it could be a good land back year. Very brief business before I let these two take over. The fun business is that we're actually going to hear work from both of these authors tonight, which is exciting. So you get a double header. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. How do we feel about picture taking? Is picture taking okay?
Absolutely.
Takeaway. It's mandatory, actually. So picture taking is fine. Just if you get a call, please step away to take it and don't take it in the audience. That would be embarrassing for you. So please do check out also our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you are at right now. We have copies of books by both of our authors at the front register. You can find them there. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so much. And it's also Origin Stories Pub Week, right? It just came out on Tuesday, so it's and sales in the first week are very helpful to an author. So if you can get them there for you and everyone on your block, think about it. It's always helpful. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors who are joining us tonight. First, Colin Winnette is the author of several books translated into multiple languages. His most recent book, Users, was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction, a New York Times Editor's Choice, a New Yorker Best Book, and was called The First Great Novel About Virtual Reality by The Nation. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including McSweeney's, Playboy, and more. He is also a Green Apple stalwart fave, so thank you, Colin. Let's give one more hand for Colin. And last but most certainly not least, Corinna Vallianatos is the author of The Beforeland and My Escapee, winner of the Grace Paley Prize for Short Fiction. Her work has appeared in Best American Short Stories 2023, McSweeney's, and elsewhere. She lives in California and Virginia, and her book, Origin Stories, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's give one more hand for Corinna Vallianatos.
Hi, Corinna. Thanks so much for asking me to join you here in celebration of your absolutely fantastic collection of short stories, Origin Stories. I devoured it. I loved it so much. I can't wait to read it again. Everyone should buy it. In fact, if you want to go buy it and start reading it right now, you have my permission. But, you know, as a part of the event, you asked me to read some. So I could start with that.
Please.
I'll read a short selection so we can get to the main event. This is, I just finished a draft of a new novel, and this, thank you. This is the opening of the novel, and nobody else has heard this. This is the first time I've ever read it, so I thought I would do a special presentation of it. And I won't tell you the title, because right now it is not good. Charles Wright had tucked in his children, taken a powerful sleeping pill, and climbed into bed before he heard a sound like someone at the back door trying to get in. He fought against the fast-acting pill while his mind made excuses. It's the wind. It's an animal. It's a dream. Whatever the sound was, he listened to it on his back in bed, hoping it would fall away, but it didn't. The sound continued, insistent and intentional, until Charles rose from the tangle of his sheets and forced himself through the darkness to investigate. From the hallway, Charles saw the frame of his back door held the shape of a man, pressing his body against the glass and clumsily working the door's handle. "Hey, can I help you?" Speaking quietly, so as not to wake or alarm his children, Charles did his best to sound tough, but the awkward balance of divergent intentions left him feeling more like a puffed-up finch, soft and round and ridiculous. His next instinct was to grab his children and run, but the dreamlike side effects of resisting the medication he'd just taken were so reliable it had developed a secondary recreational use among adventurous teens. Charles knew that if he attempted to flee, there was a good chance it would only delay his confrontation with the stranger until after he'd lost himself to the pill. The shape of the man pressed its body into the glass again, and Charles moved closer. He stepped into the living room, hoping the sight of him would be enough to turn the man around and divorce him of his intentions. "What do you want?" This time, at the sound of Charles's voice, the man stopped pushing at the door and stepped his body up to the glass. He was staring through it, trying to see inside. Just a few feet away now, Charles could see that the would-be intruder was a tall man with broad shoulders and a narrow face dotted with thoughtful imperfections. A single mole on the left side of his neck, a shy scrim of stubble on his chin, a slim nose that tilted slightly to the right. Charles braced for the stranger to push against the door again, but he didn't. In fact, he remained eerily still, staring in like he was hung up on some kind of a glitch. Charles stepped closer, inching up to the glass between them until he could see deep into the wandering eyes of the stranger at his door. It took him only a moment to find the yellow buried there, hidden at the back of each pupil like a shy snake in a crowded zoo exhibit. It was a welcome discovery, and it instantly slowed Charles's heart rate. His breath came easy. This was not so alarming. This he could handle. "Where'd you come from, huh?" He spoke in a playful, lilting voice that came out much more naturally to him than his prior attempt at intimidation. "Are you lost? Did you get lost?" Charles slid open the glass back door and reached behind the model's ear for its safety node. He pressed the tip of his finger into the soft indentation behind its earlobe, setting the unit to parkable, so it could only move now under the guidance of his touch. "I'm just going to move you away from here, all right? Nothing too weird." Charles stepped outside and set his hands on the model in order to lead it from his yard, but as he did, he detected movement in the house behind him. He turned to discover one of his two indistinguishable sons watching them from the hallway. "Go back to bed," Charles spoke through the open door. As if in response, the boy tilted backward until he was folded in half. Charles blinked, and the boy shrank into a shadow on the floor and went still. The medication, Charles realized, had begun its hallucinatory work. He was alarmed to feel it happening so fast. He'd only just taken the pill, and already he was losing his ability to track the edges of what was real and what was not, which meant he could no longer fully trust himself, and that he needed to hurry. Charles returned both hands to the model and walked it away from his apartment, feeling at times like he was leading it, and at others like it was leading him. As they made their way across the grass and through the moonlight, Charles saw an infinite orchard at the edge of his yard, which he recognized from one of his son's video games. He ignored it, though it was unnaturally beautiful. Luckily, Charles knew the edges of his home well enough to successfully navigate the two of them through the alley behind his building, which led to a street they could follow up the hill 2 blocks to the nearest park. He needed to find a safe place to take the model out of Parkable, far enough away from his home to keep it from wandering back, but close enough that the pill would not get Charles lost on the return journey. That was going to prove more difficult than he'd originally thought, however, as after a few steps together up the public street, Charles found the first intersection they encountered had acquired the appearance of an asterisk. He stood there with the model, puzzling at the impossibly angled options before him, while the model beheld the same curiosity with blank indifference. Charles had grown so confused he was about to give up, deciding instead to abandon the model to the treacherous intersection and turn back, if only he knew which way was back, when the model finally spoke. "Where do you mean to take us?" it said, plainly and politely. Charles had known what to expect, but he was still surprised at how soothing the model's voice was, especially after what it had just been attempting. As much hand-wringing as they had caused over the past few years, the models had been exquisitely designed. It was hard to find a flaw and easy to overlook them for what they were. Charles had no idea how they'd done it, but the leading manufacturers had dialed in the speech patterns and intonations of the new models to such a precise degree, it was hard for him to hear one speak without feeling that he was talking to an old friend, someone who had seen him through countless tough times and who had always been there to put him at ease. "The park," said Charles, "just up the hill." As he spoke, he pictured the words emerging from some unknown darkness at the back of his mind, like ancient aquatic beasts. "It is this way," said the model. It pointed with a stoic hand toward one of the intersection's infinitely branching arms, and, like a hypnotist, suddenly clarifying the subconscious confusion of a watch-induced trance, it snapped the endless variations spiraling out before them into a single, reliable path forward.
And you said you're still juggling title ideas.
Yeah, right now it's called Wonderkin, which is like very alien and techish, and I don't love it. So I gotta call it something else.
All right. Well, if there are any
Yeah, if you have any
title ideas from audience. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
Thanks, Car, for hosting, and Colin, thank you so much for reading and for being in conversation with me. I really appreciate it. And thanks to you all for coming out on this blustery night to Green Apple. San Francisco's lucky to have this wonderful store. So I'm going to read just a shortish story from the new collection. A little, thing that story writers do sometimes is they kind of sneak maybe a slight story into the middle of a collection, or a story that they feel doesn't, maybe trumpet quite as overtly some of the themes of the book, or maybe it's just a little one-off, or maybe, they find it amusing and they worry that other people might not, or I don't know, they're just like the little sort of stepchildren of the collection. But as a reader, I find that I'm often most drawn to those middle stories, the stories that are sort of just a little odd or porous, or perhaps don't feel as polished as the stories that a collection opens with, the kind of the real prime real estate there. So I'm going to read a middle story from Origin Stories. Can you all hear me? Am I close enough to the microphone? It's called The Artist's Wife. I had high hopes for being friends with an artist, but as it turned out, the artist's wife found me hopelessly uncool. A seething boredom came over her face whenever we got together, and the artist's art was much too expensive for me and my husband to buy. I'd only ever seen his paintings on his website, where they lost the intensity my husband claimed they possessed and seemed simply to blare. They depicted smooth, seal-skinned figures in scrubs, laboring in operating theaters and over dentist chairs. In one, the figure, legs planted far apart, tugged at the teeth of a bear trap. In another, the figure removed a porcelain doggy holding a little red heart on a loop in its mouth from the cavity of a child's chest. In a third, I wasn't sure. A grotesque surprise awaited one, I supposed. The artist was always high when he worked, my husband said. He would get too bored otherwise. I blamed myself for the situation with the artist's wife. I'd worn jeans and a flannel button-up to her birthday party at a restored bowling alley in Silver Lake. The bowling alley had gleaming wooden floors and orange sherbet-colored molded plastic chairs. The wife was wearing jeans too, with patent leather high heels, and I suppose that made all the difference. She was a teacher at a Waldorf school, and many of the guests at the party were parents of children in her 3-4 class. The men were bearded and broad, with thick, soft shoulders and mighty calves that burst out of their fanciful socks. The women were cautious, assessing, their eyes oracular and their faces so sharp-boned they appeared antique. When we arrived, neither the artist nor his wife introduced us to anyone. This would be fine if we were in a living room or a backyard where you could attach and remove, and there were always a few people in the kitchen eating chips. But the alley was cliquish, the guests clustered in small groups, laughing over their gawky mini-stepping on the lanes and high-fiving when somebody bowled a strike. I got separated from my husband, rather he separated himself from me, and ended up bowling a silent game with another solitary guest. We simply found ourselves at the same lane. My bowling ball was much too light and skittered across the slick wood as if across a licked popsicle. His ball was heavy, thudding, and strangely effective. He was attractive in a haggard way, and I considered that there was no female equivalent for that. I'd worn the flannel and jeans because that was the kind of thing I wore. I knew I looked as if I were picking out paint samples at a hardware store or trundling recycling to the curb, but I didn't mind. Undertaking some common endeavor, in other words, living in the world as men did. Snatches of conversation floated our way. Finally, I said, "Why does coal always have to be the monster?" Plowed right through a migrating cloud of painted ladies, I couldn't freaking slow down. When the artist, my husband in tow, approached the silent bowler and they began to talk, I realized two things. One, I was the lowliest person there, for the artist had approached him, not me. And two, the silent bowler and I had a lot in common, but we hadn't let ourselves discover it. We had in common a taste in music, we had in common a self-conscious laugh, we had in common a certain stance toward the world. I gathered he was a fellow sufferer. Cake was being served. I accepted a large piece and gobbled it up, then fled to the car. I slipped my socked feet out of my bowling shoes, climbed into the back seat, and curled up on my side. I let my mind drift. I thought of my past, college, riding buses, tumbling golden leaves. Leaves tumbled here in December, papered the sidewalks obligingly. My second year of college, I rented an apartment with a girl I'd known since childhood. We thought it would be funny to read bedtime stories to each other. In my memory, this plan was devised by both of us, but it was probably mine. She twisted and turned angrily in her bed as I read the first few chapters of The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, and then she began staying out very late at night. She'd realized our plan smacked of the desperation of people who wanted to be cheered, and the fact that I had come to this realization, and the fact that she had come to this realization before me, though surely I was on the cusp of it myself, meant that I was solely responsible for how she felt. She left notes taped above the kitchen sink that said, "Do your fucking dishes and take out your trash." My trash, I thought. I let the phone ring when I suspected it was my boyfriend calling, so he'd think I was out with friends. I'd listen to his cheerful voice leaving a message, a voice from a distant land. I returned to the bowling alley and stood next to the long silver rack where the balls were kept. A strange idea came to me. We were in one of the artist's paintings, I thought, and in that painting, His wife carried a whip like a black rat's tail, and if she deemed you a poor guest, stilted or boring or awkward or frazzled or uncomely, the painting came to life. A trapdoor opened beneath your unlucky feet, and you fell a short distance onto a heap of bodies. I could practically feel the sudden lurch, the swing in my gut as I plunged down onto a writhing pile. I apologized profusely as I rolled off to the side. We were in a storeroom. The silent bowler was there too, squatting on his heels. He did not look pensive, though he should have looked pensive. We heard the clicking of the wife's high heels coming down the stairs, whip rasping behind her. An iron key rattled in the iron lock, and the heavy door groaned open. She spoke to us sharply and assigned us impossible, mind-numbing tasks. I was given a toothbrush and told to scrub the mold from between the honeycombed stones of the wall and floor. The silent bowler was told to polish the tiny high window using his own palm and saliva. We were the painting's janitors, its silent labor. Every work of art was supported by people like us. The wife left. Guests kept plummeting through the trapdoor onto the pile of us, and we rearranged ourselves bitterly. We did not ask each other how we knew the artist or his wife. One way or another, suffice it to say, from here or there, why would it matter? What mattered now was what had been taken away. To have one's shine dulled so completely, to be tumbled in with those whom you frankly could conceive of belonging here, well, it was dispiriting. Let's talk, someone said. Let's stay human to each other. Goat cheese, yay or nay? Improv, embarrassing or liberating? Do you follow any of the organized religions? My husband strolled by the rack and I reached out and grasped his arm. Where are you going? The bar. I trailed him there. He ordered a beer and received a tall, sloshing glass. Want one? I shook my head. A slim arm tattooed with dark blue script reached between us to accept a drink. The artist's wife. I happened to know that the tattoo read, "with pleasure," in Russian, a language she could not speak. She clinked her glass against my husband's. Can I get you something, Kathy? Oh, no thanks. I had a corner piece of cake. I'm bursting. I looked at my husband. I think we're taking off soon, but this was great. Not that soon, he said. I was the assistant to someone who ran a lecture series at the college where my husband taught. I didn't get to choose who came. I arranged for travel and accommodations, made sure they got paid, picked them up and dropped them off at the airport. I was glad not to have to choose who came because if the readers were clumsy panderers or culturally illiterate or excessively sweaty, it wouldn't be my fault. At the last reading, the writer had gotten up in front of the audience with nothing in hand, no sheaf of papers, no book. She stood at the podium and said that just that afternoon she'd decided to abandon the novel she'd been writing, the novel she'd been planning to read from. The problem was her distance to it, she said. She'd never figured out her distance to it. And she'd realized something else. It wasn't about life. And there was abso-fucking-lutely nothing she could do about that. The director of the lecture series cast a desperate glance at me, so I went to the front of the auditorium. Any questions? I said. Later, she told me it would have been better to thank everyone for coming and point them to the coffee and refreshments in the next room. Because what questions could anyone possibly have after that, the director said. Does she think that one book is about life and another isn't? Does she think life's so recognizable? I regarded her with interest and she went on. Our first stories were populated with gods and monsters, she said. Take the Odyssey. Would somebody say, well, that's not about life because there's no such thing as a Cyclops? Because Polyphemus doesn't really exist? No, we understand human ingenuity, the longing to go home. And we understand, too, that it's never easy, that all manner of monsters must spring in our way. Might spring in our way. Must spring in our way. For if it were easy to go home, we wouldn't want to. So for her to stand up there and offer no explanation to our students, who, after all, are not well-versed in failure, who have possibly never failed in their lives, it left a bad taste in my mouth. Maybe it wasn't the monsters that were the problem, I said. Maybe it was the longing that was missing. The director cocked her head and seemed to entertain the idea for a moment. But longing's the easiest thing in the world to invent, she said. Throw some longing in a pot, stir it up with an absent father and a moldering trunk of old letters. My God, writers act like it's so hard. They should talk to surgeons or janitors or home health care workers or me. Or you, she said startlingly, because I'd never thought she thought much of my job. The next morning, I drove the writer to the airport. I was tempted to tell her how easy what she had not done was. I scrutinized her for sorrow and humiliation, but observed only a tendency to shield her mouth with her hand when she talked. She spoke to me behind her hand of her love for her Instant Pot. When I pulled up to the unloading zone, she removed her hand and bid me goodbye as if we were old friends, throwing her arms around my neck and pulling me close. I'll read whatever you write whenever you write it, I said foolishly. Thank you, she said. You don't know how much that means to me, but I'm going to massage school. The artist's wife and my husband had ordered a second round of drinks. His gallerist gets half of what he makes, she was saying, and he likes her well enough, but how much do you have to like a person to be okay with that? A whole hell of a lot. You have to want to pay their mortgage on their summer house in the Hudson Valley, my husband said. Or, in her case, Venice. Venice? It's outrageous, she said, with all its sinking. Why can't we just get over Italy? About his paintings, I said, do you understand them? She blushed and I softened toward her then. The bloodlust of the other discarded guests would be rising. They would have figured out they had to work together to break the lock with their combined strength, wrench open the heavy door, scale the stairs. They were about to pour back into the alley, and whose side would I be on? I'm 36, she said finally. I'm done trying to understand. A woman who knew she was younger than the woman she was talking to would always mention her age if she could. It was his idea to have my party here. He thought it would be easier than having it at our house, less personal, safer. My husband was nodding. Let me show you something, she said. Me, he said. Colleen. I followed her to the end of the lanes as if we were after an errant pin, through a door and down a flight of stairs to the storage room. Gold paint peeled off the doorknob. A waxing and buffing machine stood in the corner next to a mound of orphaned bowling shoes. A small canvas leaned against the wall. She picked it up and hugged it to herself. My birthday present, a portrait. Other men take their wives to dinner, she said, and turned it to face me. The paint was thick and the woman's forehead hideously bulbous, not in the manner of a holy figure of thought, but rather someone about to burst with consternation. Her bun sat atop her head like a tiny, shiny gourd, and her eyes were splayed unevenly as if to avoid catching sight of each other. Yet there was beauty in her face. She would not see it. She would not see how he saw her. Love, if it meant anything, was private, lonely, inexplicable. Do you like it? She said. My husband and I left and drove east to the town where we lived, where the bowling alleys were not restored, but were big, cold, raucous places. To know that the artist could paint something like that, create something so true it became continuous, not a fixed image, but an experience of looking, made his choice to paint anything else incomprehensible to me, cruel. I did not think it was safety he was after, but its opposite. I exited the freeway. At the end of the off-ramp, a man stood next to a plastic bucket of roses in chemical colors. He had other things for sale, too. Fuzzy blankets folded over a line, lidded cups of fruit. I lay awake that night, trembling with eagerness for morning. Thanks.
Yeah, just amazing. Like, all the stories are so incredible. It's funny because I have literally done that, like been at a party that I can't like find my way into and gone and hid in the car for a little bit for like a private moment. You're like eating up time, but you're also kind of revisiting these traumas or whatever. But it's that story, because I did have this one question, and that story sort of stands out to me as fitting within it, although it's slightly different because the artist's wife is not someone she's super close with, although she does invite her in. But it feels like there's a recurring sort of theme of characters who are in intimate relationships or intimate situations, like lovers, spouses, parents and kids, but they have this kind. They're more like these sort of isolated, orbiting consciousnesses. You know, they don't have a lot of like porousness to their thoughts and feeling. I think it's kind of there is this solitary quality to a lot of it that makes for these like really beautiful moments of like observation and humor, as you say there. But I wondered if that was something that you were kind of pursuing in the collection, I guess, like isolated people within intimate relationships, or if that just feels like an inherent part of intimacy, like being sort of isolated. I mean, it says in there, like, love is a private, sort of lonely thing.
I mean, I think it probably grows out of a craft, some way in which I was able to construct the stories, and that is to let the kind of interior of the character propel the story forward rather than the exterior action or plot or sort of more traditional sense of plot. And so, you know, like characters in conversation or interaction or whatever, that's all happening in the sort of exterior world. And my interest as a writer has always been more in the kind of like subterranean, meditative, you know, quality of thought, the surprising quality of thought, and then the ability to observe as a solitary, you know, character, as you said. And so probably that dynamic, although I think that's really interesting that you notice that, and I think it speaks to some of the themes of the collection, I think really probably grows out of my interest as a writer, and that is like to lose oneself in, you know, interiority, and to, you know, the exterior world sort of takes a backseat to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it has a really profound effect in some of the stories where the characters are behaving somewhat badly at times, you know, but certainly not depicted or described in a way that like communicates judgment or anything. And it's because it's so locked into their consciousness, you sort of realize a moment later, like, oh, that was kind of mean. Like, I'm thinking particularly of the like one of the earlier stories with the mother and daughter. What was it called? Was it A Neighboring State? Or no? Something in Common. Something in Common.
Yeah, the mother moves to be near the daughter.
Yeah, and you it's like it took me a moment, sort of whiplash, to like realize the small cruelties that the mother is like inflicting along the way because I'm so invested in her consciousness. And like that's interesting to hear that you're kind of leading from the place of like focusing on the character's interiority. And I wondered what is it like, what magnetizes you to a specific character? Like, how do you find your way into these characters, and what tends to, you know, sustain that magnetism? Like, once you found your way into a character, what do you see are generally the things that you gravitate toward? Stay with.
I mean, I think this collection, I let myself write a little bit more explicitly autobiographical. I mean, not autofiction per se, but autobiographical fiction. And so the characters aren't me, but they're a kind of like alternate version of me, or like an exaggerated version, or a sort of like assemblage of traits and obsessions and influences and points of origin. So I think I loosened my reins a little bit with this collection. My first collection, I was very maybe reticent to write autobiographically, and so I felt like I had to kind of create characters from wholesale from cloth. And in this collection, I think they're distorted or transformed versions of myself. You know, in almost all of the stories. I mean,
like AWP becomes Weeps.
Yeah, exactly. yeah, that's right. And so I think like I was following my own obsessions and my own, you know, I mean, I think the title grew out of a story called Origin Story, but I think it spoke to me as a title for the collection because all of the stories in some way seem to be about characters moving away from their own points of origin or states of mind, roving restlessly away from one's kind of like one's beginnings, one's references, one's influences, and then in some odd way finding you know that they've turned back to that origin after all, even after trying to sort of flee from it.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear you talk about the title, because I kept thinking about, I mean, there's the story that's named that, but then I kept thinking about how all this, not all of them, but many of them, the ending has this quality of, it could almost be the beginning of a totally different short story. And I did wonder if that was something that you had sort of, like a project you'd intentionally given yourself for the way you were ending these stories, to be kind of like, I want to set it up so that like it could be the beginning of a story too.
That's a really interesting idea. Not consciously.
Not consciously. It definitely felt that way. A lot of them, because not that it was unsatisfying. It just felt like that story was over. But also, if you just took those last 2 paragraphs, I would totally read whatever story that was.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I think Knausgaard says novels end not because they can't go on, but because they can go on. You know, like there's this sense of like continuity, or a kind of, the prose has breathed life into the characters to an extent that they might exist beyond the page, you know, or outside of the parameters of the narrative that's unfolded. And so that's a really interesting idea, that the stories might bleed easily into a new story, or begin again.
Yeah, fun like writing prompt for yourself, right?
Right.
But like, I mean, along those lines, how do you think about an ending aside from kind of scripts? What like what's the feeling you're looking for, your hopes for it, I guess? Yeah.
Endings are really hard. I think they're the part of the story I struggle with the most. A sense of irresolution, I would say. I mean, I don't ever want a story to end with a kind of definitive thud. I think I prefer a story to end with a sense of openness, a sense of inconclusiveness, a sense of, a gentle, that there's a kind of mystery still in the life of the character and in the body of the prose. So some things, irresolution, and I think sometimes it's more satisfying than others. I mean, I can see how a story that ends with a real definitive sense of this story had to end this way and only this way is really satisfying to read, but it's just not the kind of story I'm able to write.
Yeah, and it doesn't always linger for very long. You with the feeling of like, oh, something good happened, but it doesn't leave you. Your brain doesn't keep going back to it and kind of puzzling at it, and it doesn't stay alive with you in the same way. I heard someone talk about endings, and they said, similar to what you're saying, like it's the point where the writer is handing off the story to the reader. And like anytime you hand someone something, you want them to have like some sense of what to do with it, but not be like dictating how to use it, Yeah, right. Which I thought was kind of useful. I struggled so much with endings myself. I really wanted to be definitive, but it's almost unnatural, But so you talked about this story collection being more autobiographical than usual. And that was interesting to me because I feel like while I was reading, I kept kind of asking myself privately, even though you're not really supposed to do this as a reader, like, does Corinna have a son? Because there's so much interest in the mother-son dynamic. And so not to ask you if you have a son, but like what draws you to that dynamic?
I mean, because I do have a son. I mean, the mother, the parent-child, mother-daughter, mother-son, relationship to me, I think this is maybe a line from one of the stories. It's like I think it's like the only kind of real pure experience of love, that two people have. I mean, obviously, like romantic love can be like pure and wonderful, but it's also can be complicated and like tarnished by all sorts of regrets and things. But so something about the purity of the mother-son relationship or the mother-daughter relationship, and the ways in which that purity demands a kind of, reverence and sacrifice and exerts a toll on both parties is particularly interesting to me. And, I wrote these stories over the last, I don't know, I think that the first story I wrote that ended up in the collection, I wrote maybe more than 10 years ago. So I wasn't like only working on this, but so the collection tracks, essentially my son growing from a child into an adult. And so, it's just a relationship that's been, in the forefront of my mind for more than a decade.
Okay, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I was interested in it. It's also like while you're talking about that, I was just thinking about how the parent-child relationship, the love that exists there, it's one of the only times where you're there for the beginning and end of the love duration. I mean, like you fall in love with someone at some point, but they bring so much of this past with them into the relationship that you kind of slowly discover. But with the child, it's like there's a beginning and there's an end, and there's no outside of that.
Right.
Anyway, so let's talk about how the collection came together. You said you were writing it for over 10 years.
I mean, I think the oldest story, A Neighboring State, was written in 2012, 2013. But then I took a lot of time away from it, and I wrote a novel, and then I turned back. And so really most of the stories in the collection are written over about, maybe a 5-6 year span, something like that.
And did it, was there kind of an organizing principle in your head when you were pulling them together, or was it I just love these stories?
It was more like I struggled to write a novel. It didn't feel natural. It was a kind of unwieldy form for me, and I wanted to return to a form that I feel like I understand, although there's still so much about story writing I'm still learning, I'm still figuring out. But the looseness of the form, the mystery that the form allows for, the kind of inconclusiveness, as I already spoke about, the sort of strange poetry of the thing has always attracted me. I've always loved short stories, and so I think it was after writing the Beforehand and feeling rather frustrated with that process that I turned back to story writing, just knowing I could do something with it. I could probably cobble together another book of stories, and so the kind of organizing principle, the idea of influences, origins, that didn't come until much later in the process. After I wrote the origin story, and then I started to think about what's one of the threads that sort of runs through the collection. And there's a kind of restlessness and a kind of searching and a kind of inevitable return to one's, where one began. I think that you can kind of see in either an overt or a subtle way in all of the stories.
Yeah, for sure. And so I imagine there were some stories that you really like that didn't quite fit into that.
A few stories, I left it. There are a few stories I left on the chopping block. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the poetry of short stories, because I did keep kind of thinking while I was reading it that this seemed like a very poetry influenced writing style or collection at least. Is that the case? Are you more of a poetry reader or a prose reader?
Well, my MFA is in poetry, so I did. I mean, many years ago. I still read some poetry, not as much as I read prose, but and I think it's less for me the figurative language, although some of the stories are more, do traffic in more figurative language than others, but more the kind of patience for the unknown that I think you find in great poems. The patience and the interest in mystery that prose writers sometimes I feel just maybe have less patience for that kind of mystery that to me is the reason I read, and the sort of energy of prose to me is the surprise, the stories as sites of moral ambiguity and surprise and despair and delight, all in the same 10 pages or whatever, gathered together. So, and I think that impulse maybe I'm drawing from my past, as a young poet and, my love for poetry.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I feel a lot of times when people talk about poetry influenced prose, they are kind of referencing really, really intentional language and stuff.
Right,
and you have that, but more it's there's a lot of space in the stories, even though they are very they are still these discrete acts of noticing from sentence to sentence, but it just feels like there's room for my brain to kind of and there's because you take all these departures, even in that the story you read, suddenly going back to that memory of the roommate and then jumping into the painting and that sort of fantasy of that, and it just happens very naturally. You're not just kind of queuing it up the whole time. You pivot in a way that I often associate with poetry to make those big leaps that leave all this space for the reader to kind of potentially get confused or to forge these connections with that space and let their imagination breathe a little.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think poems collapse kind of narrative time or
Yeah,
happenstance in this really incredible, volatile, compressed way. And I think in the best stories and some of the stories in the collection try to do that sort of active compression and surprise and swerves, these kind of like, swerving away from where you thought perhaps the story was going in just a really swift and sudden gesture rather than a laborious kind of like everybody can see what's happening here kind of way. Like,
Totally.
yeah.
There's something almost like, I don't want to spoil the story, but in the neighboring estate, in the one that I mislabeled earlier, that's the one with the runaway, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a very like sudden act toward the end of that story that felt both like when I encountered it inevitable but completely unpredictable, and also weirdly like this almost like cathartic, it just felt like this real like the story, the energy that was sort of muted all along, someone like dealing with this very, very difficult thing just came bursting through in this really poignant way.
Right. I mean, I think back to an idea of endings. O'Connor says to that endings contain the inevitable and the surprising.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you saw that in that story.
Yeah.
Final gesture.
Love that story. Although that's one of the plottier stories too, I feel like, of the collection. It's so coming out of this conversation about poetry and getting into back to literary fiction. Like these don't seem like particularly plot interested stories, and not in a bad way. Like they're completely gripping in their descriptions of the world and their character dynamics, and in these moments that suddenly express all of this like sort of unspoken story. But it did seem like that was not something you were particularly drawn to, and so I wondered about your thoughts on plot, your view of its function in literary fiction, if we even need to bother with it.
I think the stories that weren't trafficking in a more traditional narrative structure needed to find some other element with which to propel them forward. Something else that would create energy and momentum.
Because the one where it's like different places they've lived.
Yes, right. So origin story, moves forward, using the kind of device of just like each section is a different site that this couple has lived in together. Quality of thought, the body of thought, moving the prose forward. I think we associate with nonfiction perhaps a little bit more overtly than with fiction, but I think certainly in literary fiction too, you can depend on that kind of the body of thought acting as the engine of the story, the quality of observation, the language itself, the structure. So I did need to generate forward momentum some other way, and I think using kind of a combination of those qualities.
You nail it. It's incredible. But so I've been asking a lot of questions. Maybe we should open it up for the audience and see what other people want to ask.
Absolutely.
Just treat it like a class. Daniel's got a question.
I got a question. I was gonna say, so you mentioned that this book is more autobiographical, and I was just curious about like how that process of working with autobiographical material felt in terms of like the artistic decision. Was it easier at times because you could sort of like rely on it and be like, well, this is the way it happened, like so that's what it has to be. It can't be something else. Or was that like confining sometimes also, like how that felt as a different approach?
Yeah, I think, obviously I did make decisions, and I moved away from autobiography many, many, many times over the course of all of the stories. But I think initially there is this feeling of kind of it being like this sort of liberating, like, I'm going to give myself permission to write a little bit more closely to the bone or a little bit more directly from my own experience. But then, yes, that does become very limiting because suddenly the imaginative truth takes a back seat if you let it. And the trick or the goal is to, even when you're writing autobiographically or when that's the generative impulse of the story, is to allow the story to move beyond that and become its own thing and completely leave autobiography behind and look for a kind of, imaginative truth and have that be the truth of the story. And I tried to do that. I mean, I hope most of the stories do that. And so, they began closer to my own experience, but I hope they end somewhere pretty far away from it, actually.
So, when I was reading Actual C, it set off this little ping of recognition, sort of, and it led me back to the set of stories with Deborah Eisenberg about a woman who visits an old school friend, and everything opens like origami, beautiful details, gorgeous, elaborate. And your story was a little more opaque, which I wonder, is that sort of a sign of the times that these busy details don't do it for us anymore? They're not the signifiers.
I love Deborah Eisenberg's work. I'm sure she did whatever she did much better than I. Yeah, I wish I could summon exactly which story of hers you're referencing. But I think it's probably a kind of again, a kind of emotional truth or imaginative truth that I was after in that story, and that might have elided some of the details, shaved some of the details away. My instinct to compress rather than to expand. I think of Eisenberg as such an incredibly expansive writer, who has this descriptive talent. And a talent for dialogue that, quite frankly, I don't have. So, the kind of opaque quality that you're describing is really probably two things. It's probably my tendency to compress, to cut. My revision process is always about cutting. And really my limitations as a writer. I mean, my limitations in terms of writing dialogue, et cetera, et cetera.
No, I think I think it's about then and now.
It could be.
Because I don't think I wasn't trying to compare you.
Yeah, but she's a writer I adore, and so if I'm a tenth of the writer that she is, I would be happy. Yeah.
Thank you both for the reading. That was great. Corinna, I love the way you talk about putting this collection together of work across, you mentioned like 2013, so 10 years worth of work. Can you talk about the process of putting it together as a collection? As you reach back to some of the earlier stories, were you just sort of like, those are finished, I'm not going to return to that? Or was there some part of the process where you were trying to reacquaint yourself or revisit the earlier material in order to somehow bring it in alignment or cohesion with the newer material, either like in terms of style or form or voice, or can you just speak to that?
I don't think that let's see. My output is very limited. I'm a very, very slow writer. And so I don't think I did a lot of revising of earlier stories. Certainly as I was composing the story, I revise obsessively and I write very slowly and I write, I don't really move forward until I'm happy with, the sentences that I have on the page. But once the story is done, I didn't in any profound way dip back into older stories. I think A Neighboring State, the story that Colin mentioned, where the daughter in the story runs away, that was a very, very early story that was written in 2013. But the rest of the stories in the collection, I think, were written in maybe the last 5-6 years. And so once they were revised sort of as I was writing them, when I was putting the collection together, I revised the entire collection, but I didn't feel that I had to go back in and substantively revise old stories. So I would say they sort of got the same treatment as, a story that I might have written much more recently, and that was to go back in, have discussions with my editor, have conversations, go back through the story, compress, cut, clarify, but I don't think the time that had elapsed really played much of a factor in terms of how much I revised the stories.
All right, with one more question, Claire, you want to be our last?
In the process of going back and putting all of these stories together and looking at them side by side, did you discover anything about your writing or any like habits or tendencies that you weren't aware of that like drifted up amongst all of them? Like, oh, I'm always writing about donkeys.
Right. I wish that were what I had discovered, actually. That would be amazing. Gosh, what did I discover about my own tendencies? There was something like that, like I was always referencing, it was really banal too. It was like I was always referencing like a kind of breakfast cereal or something. It wasn't that, like that's not it. But it was. I did realize there was some like object that cropped up. Oh, Greek yogurt. For some reason, like 4 of the stories have characters like consuming Greek yogurt, which may be because my husband actually is a great connoisseur of Greek yogurt. He has one every morning. Let me keep thinking about that and get back to you on that, because that's such a good question, but I'm answering it in this really my answer is banal, but Greek yogurt is apparently very important to me.
Sustaining for. Well, thank you all so much for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for your beautiful book. Everyone, please buy Origin Stories. It's incredible. We only got a taste of it tonight, but they're all equally great. It was an honor to talk with you.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And good luck on your novel.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Oh, of course. Can we give one more hand for Corinna Vallianatos? Thank you all for joining us. I will be very brief and just let you know, first of all, this book is great, guys. It's really good. It's a good book. It's like excellent short fiction. There's a lot of like master short fiction writers that are referenced in the book, and I was like, yeah, you're right up there. Like, let's do it. The teach it to the people. I said I would be brief. I'm not being brief. I am here to let you know that we have books available at the front register. You can find them there. If you want to, you can socialize and hang out, and if you want to have your book signed, you can ask our authors to do that. We have other books. You can take a look at those as well. I will if you have any other questions, let me know, and if not, we will see you next time. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, it's like so cute. So, I'm so glad you
Silent. We wish we did the secret. Silent history. Yes.